Deep in a small, quiet wood in western France, there is an unassuming stone wall that feels wrong. Locals who visit it at night describe the atmosphere as pretty eerie, a heaviness in the air that carries the scent of cold stone and ancient gunpowder. This wall is the only witness to 209 souls, grandfathers, mothers, and teenagers who were led into these trees in late 1793 and never walked out. They weren't soldiers captured in battle. They were suspects, bound together with simple ropes in human chains that the soldiers mockingly called rosaries. As they stood in the mud, they faced a firing squad of young conscripts whose hands were shaking so violently that their muskets clattered against their brass buttons. The revolutionary government tried to delete these names from history, but the earth refused to bury the truth. Tonight, we step into the shadows of Doué-la-Fontaine to break a 230-year-old silence. This is the shadow of the 209. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the French countryside, particularly in the region once known as the military Vendée. It is a silence not of emptiness, but of suppression. If you drive into the small town of Doué-la-Fontaine and head toward the edge of the woods as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, you might feel it, a heaviness in the air, a moisture that seems to carry the scent of cold stone and ancient gunpowder. In the center of one such small wood, an unassuming stone wall stands as a sentinel. It looks like a boundary from an old farm, but if you look closer, there is a panel. It is a panel that explains the inexplicable. It tells the story of 209 souls who walked into these trees one night in late 1793 and never walked out. They weren't soldiers captured on a battlefield. They were suspects, men, women, and the elderly, whose only crime was the suspicion of a lingering loyalty to an older world. To understand how 209 people end up in a mass grave in a quiet woodland, we have to go back to the year the world went mad, 1793. The French Revolution had moved beyond the hopeful days of the Bastille. It had entered a phase of cannibalistic survival. The king was dead, executed in January, and the young republic was surrounded by the monarchies of Europe, all hungry for its collapse. But the greatest threat was perceived to be within. In the West, a rebellion had ignited, not of nobles or generals, but of peasants. They were the Vendéens, and they fought for their priests, their traditions, and their faith. The government in Paris did not see them as citizens with grievances. They saw them as a cancer that had to be excised. This wasn't a war of borders. It was a war of extermination. The geography of this region, the bocage, played a terrifying role in the tragedy. It is a landscape of high hedgerows, narrow sunken lanes, and dense thickets. It was a labyrinth where the Republican blue soldiers felt constantly watched. The local brigands, as they were called, could vanish into the woods after a devastating ambush, leaving the soldiers frustrated and terrified. This tactical advantage led to a deep-seated fury. Unable to catch the elusive guerrilla fighters, the Republican officers turned their vengeance toward the civilian population, the wives, the parents, and the children who provided the rebels with bread and shelter. By August of 1793, the National Convention in Paris issued a decree that changed the nature of human life in the West. It called for the destruction of the Vendée. The words were literal. Forests were to be cut down, crops burned, and the race of rebels extinguished. This was the atmosphere in which the 209 victims of Doué-la-Fontaine were rounded up. They were caught in the web of the law of suspects, a rule defined so broadly that it could include anyone who failed to display sufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. In the eyes of the revolutionary commissions, to be a suspect was already to be guilty. The specific horror of the 209 is inextricably linked to one man, Jean-Baptiste Parein. A former lawyer and a fervent Jacobin, Parein was the president of a temporary revolutionary commission that moved through the department like a purifying fire. He believed that the republic could only be founded on the ashes of its enemies. In late 1793, Parein and his colleague, Félix, established a military court at Doué-la-Fontaine. The town's prison was already choking. Records show that 1,200 people were crammed into cells meant for a fraction of that number. The conditions were wretched. 184 prisoners died of disease and malnutrition before they could even face a judge. For Parein, this slow death was a waste of resources. he sought a more direct method of resolution. Witnesses to the events at Doué-la-Fontaine described Parein's verdicts not as sentences, but as orders to assassinate. There was no defense, no weighing of evidence. The selection of the 209 victims was a chillingly bureaucratic process. They were grouped together: farmers, domestic servants, and the elderly. Among them was an 18-year-old boy named Pierre Guillet and a 34-year-old servant named Anne Le Monceau. The logic was simple. If a village could not be proven loyal, its inhabitants were refused. Imagine the scene as the sun began to set on that night in December. The 209 were led from the prison of Doué-la-Fontaine. They were not bound with the heavy iron of hardened criminals. Instead, they were tied together with simple ropes, a method the soldiers mockingly called the rosary. Think about that for a moment. They were bound in a single, vulnerable line, a mockery of the Catholic prayer beads they held so dear. The procession moved toward the edge of town, toward a small, dense wood that provided a natural screen for the work ahead. Think about the sound of 418 wooden clogs hitting the frozen mud in unison, whispered prayers in the dark, the smell of the damp oak leaves, and the biting winter air. The soldiers tasked with the execution were not seasoned veterans. They were a newly conscripted battalion of young men, many of whom had never seen combat. They were boys from other provinces, told they were fighting monsters, only to find themselves facing people who looked exactly like their own fathers and sisters. The archival records are haunting here. They state that the soldiers were trembling with fear as they leveled their muskets. The order to fire was given, but a battalion trembling with fear does not aim well. The first volley did not bring the clean silence of death. It brought a cacophony of screams and the thick, acrid smell of sulfur and black powder. Many of the 209 were merely wounded, struggling on the forest floor in the human chain. The Republican officers, fearing a loss of discipline or a surge of pity from their men, forced the soldiers to reload and fire again into the writhing mass of bodies. Those who still moved were finished with bayonets. The cold steel did what the musket balls could not. The pits had already been dug. The 209 were rolled into the earth, their identities stripped from the official registers of the Republic. The government sought to bury the memory of the event along with the victims. They wanted the wood to remain just a wood. But you cannot bury a ghost, and the earth does not forget the blood spilled upon it. The small wood became a site of local legend, a place where the leaves seemed to turn red earlier in the autumn and where the wind carried a specific mournful whistle through the trees. The choice of a woodland for mass execution was not accidental. In revolutionary France, the forest was a place of savage mystery, the hiding place of the brigand. By executing them in the woods, the Republic was symbolically returning them to the savagery they supposedly represented. They were being cast out of civilization. But the wall that exists today in that wood has turned that symbolism on its head. It is a literal boundary between the world of the living and the world of the forgotten. For the person who visits it at night, that wall acts as a conduit. It is a physical reminder that beneath the moss and the leaf litter lies a tragedy that the modern world has largely chosen to overlook. For nearly 2 centuries, the Republic tried to maintain the silence. The official narrative was one of a glorious struggle for freedom against fanatical nobles who had tricked the peasants into rebelling. The civilian massacres were excluded from school books. It wasn't until the bicentennial of the revolution in 1989 that the dark side of 1793 began to be fully reckoned with. The eerie feeling that visitors describe today is the feeling of encountering a silenced history. The panel on the wall is an attempt to break that silence. It lists the names that the revolutionary commissioners tried to delete. One of the most triggering details of that night is the silence that must have followed the final gunshot. In that silence, prisoners could hear the soldiers' muskets clattering against their brass buttons because their hands were shaking so violently. This detail, the shaking hands of the executioners, is perhaps the most humanizing element of the story. It suggests that even in the height of the terror, the human conscience was not entirely extinguished. The boys pulling the triggers knew on some primal level that what they were doing was an affront to the very liberty they were supposedly defending. When we talk about 209 209 civilians. The number is so large it becomes an abstraction, but history is made of individuals. Among the 209 was an old man of 73 named Berger. He had been imprisoned for 18 months on a minor charge before being dragged to the woods. Imagine his last thoughts as he stood in the mud, tied to a neighbor, looking into the eyes of a soldier young enough to be his grandson. The terror of that night was not just in the moment of the gunshot, it was in the days leading up to it in the prison of Douai. The captives lived in a state of sensory deprivation and psychological torture, watching their friends taken away, never to return. They heard the sounds of patriotic burials in the town, parades of sarcophagi celebrating the martyrs of liberty, while they, the victims of the terror, were treated as refuse. Today, the Vendée is often looked at by historians as the first modern example of total war or even state-sponsored genocide. The methods used at Doué-la-Fontaine, the systematic grouping of civilians, the dehumanizing rhetoric, and the target-driven nature of the violence would become a dark template for the 20th century. The Vendée became a land defined by its suffering and its refusal to surrender its identity. The 209 individuals in the wood are part of a larger narrative of resistance against the homogenization of the state. Their execution was not a military necessity. It was a ritual of purification. As you stand by that wall in the wood at night, you realize that the past is not dead. It isn't even past. The pretty eerie atmosphere is the weight of 209 stories waiting to be told. The wall stands as a physical manifestation of a moral law, demands we remember the dead. It is a memorial tombstone for those whose identities were meant to be erased. The Republic tried to turn this wood into a place of savagery and forgetting, but the people who live here, who walk these paths, have turned it into a place of pilgrimage. The story of the wood at Doué-la-Fontaine is a warning. It is a warning about the dangers of ideological certainty. It shows us what happens when a government decides that its own people are the enemy. It shows us how easily the line between citizen and suspect can vanish. The 209 were victims of a binary worldview that saw the world only in terms of with us or against us. As we leave the woods and the shadows of the trees lengthen, the silence returns. But it is a different silence now. It is the silence of justice being performed through the act of remembering. Every time someone walks past that wall and feels that eerie chill, the 209 are being acknowledged. They are no longer just numbers on a forgotten list. They are Pierre, they are Anne, they are Berger. They are the 209 souls who remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and decrees, it is a collection of heartbeats. And though those heartbeats were silenced in this wood 230 years ago, their echo still rings through the trees, waiting for someone to listen. If you ever find yourself in Western France, in that quiet bocage where the hedgerows still guard the secrets of the past, find that small wood. Walk past the town's edge and look for the wall. Stand there for a moment in the dark. Don't look for ghosts, look for the truth. Because the most terrifying part of this story isn't that it happened in 1793. The most terrifying part is how easily we forget that the ground we walk on is built on the layers of those who came before us, and that some of those layers were laid down in the dark, in the woods, under the shaking hands of boys who were told that killing their neighbors was the only way to be free. The 209 are still there. They are part of the wood now, and they are waiting for the world to finally, truly hear their names.